is a major challenge is wind. That's something you probably have to deal with a lot more.
In the UK, so we get a lot of wind, and there's two aspects in a way to it. One is the physical impact of the wind, and the other is the creation of these microclimates.
The wind has also interacts with the previous subject of water as well. It's not just the sun itself that uses up all the water in the soil and evaporates it, but also strong winds. They'll accelerate the evaporation of water from the soil, but they'll also accelerate transpiration rates from the plants themselves.
Welcome to the Beet Podcast. I'm your host today, Jacques from Jacques in the Garden, and today we actually have two guests on. They're the authors of a new book called Silvohorticulture, which, little spoiler alert, basically is we're going to be talking about blending trees, not just fruit trees, but trees in general, with vegetable and fruit growing at large scales, but also down to the scale of the garden. And those two authors are Andy Dibben and Ben Raskin. This has been a really fun book to read through. I've actually learned quite a lot. And the way that you guys approached it was also, I thought, very interesting. So thanks for coming on today, and I can't wait to talk about trees.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Jack.
I wanted to actually kick this off. Reading through the book, there's so many interesting nuggets of information. And one of the fun ones that immediately you start off with is the domestication of trees, actually, in general, and how tree domestication actually predates vegetables by quite a bit. So I have here written down that figs were domesticated in the Jordan Valley around 11,200 years ago, which was about 1,000 years before wheat, right?
Yeah, that's something that surprised me, Jack. When we were doing the research for the book, I'd sort of always believed that in sort of anthropology terms that wheat was the first domesticated crop. So I too was surprised that trees came first by quite a long way.
Yeah, and then after that, you guys mentioned guava, which I had no idea was actually domesticated 9,500 years ago in the Southwest Amazon. And then that was also basically the same time that the first vegetables like squash were domesticated in the Mexico-Peru region. So for thousands of years, people were already domesticating and producing fruit at scale, I guess, or maybe not at scale, but at least intentionally. And even the guavas down here in Southwest the Amazon, it's amazing because I love guavas. I had no idea that they had such a long history. And so for me, that was really interesting. But it just goes to show that as humans, fruit trees have always been very important to society and to our food production. And it seems like at this scale, basically, probably had an important role in our development of agriculture in general. So I'd love if you guys could break down the different types of Silvo X. Like you break down a few different options in the book, the first one being Silvopasture. If you guys could expand on that and then tell us exactly what Silvohorticulture means.
So, I'll answer that, shall Andy? Yeah. There's the term agroforestry, which is mixing up agriculture and trees. Is sort of almost like an overarching one, and then the sort of various ways of breaking that down is using the word silvo, which means tree, with different farming types. So silvopasture, as you say, that means mixing it with livestock production. Then there's potentially silvo arable, which is where you're looking at crops, corn, barley, that sort of thing. And then we've used silvohorticulture, meaning vegetable crops, or potentially flowers and other things as well. I know there's a bit of differentiation between exactly what horticulture means between the US and the UK. Right. So we had discussions with the publishers about exactly what to call it. And then you move sort of down as well into forest gardening or food forests and things like that, which tend to be smaller scale and more productive, but more complex as well. So what we've tended to focus on is what's called alley cropping. So where you've got sort of tend to have straight rows of trees and straight rows of vegetables. And I guess that's partly because Andy and I both come from the sort of commercial farming end where we're using machinery often and we need to be efficient for harvesting. Obviously, once you get down into a garden scale, you don't have to have rows in the same way, so you can be a bit more creative and flexible.
Yeah, no, I thought it was very interesting to think about all the different aspects that if you are trying to farm at scale for true production, there's a lot that goes into selecting, spacing, the varieties, orientations, which we're going to get into a little bit, but it's just fascinating to me because there's so many lessons to learn from larger scale production and farming that could be translated down to the garden level. And the basic principle of silvo anything, right, whether you're doing pasture or vegetables or fruit production, is that you have the trees in place. And the trees themselves are really the star of the system because they open up so many different avenues when it comes to mixing, let's say, animals, like having the option of dropped fruit for them to forage, or the shade that it provides, the cooling effects, the manure that the animals leave behind, the weed control. Like, it makes a lot of sense to think about blending those kinds of things together. And something that I've actually only recently started doing in the garden this past year, which is why I was so excited to read this book, was blending the fruit trees into the garden. I guess more of would be more akin to food forest than alley cropping, of course. But the lessons that I've learned in this book and the way that you've talked about it has really helped me understand what I am doing with my trees. I think we should break down all the different use cases and sort of benefits of these trees. And the first and most, I guess, almost obvious in a sense, is the vertical stacking, like the ability of increasing your overall harvest. I'd love to hear a little bit about your guys' thought on that.
Well, I think that's interesting, Jack. I think most of us as gardeners will, actually probably experimented with vertical stacking already, but perhaps on a slightly smaller scale. Whether that be growing basil underneath your tomatoes, or we sometimes grow sort of radish or crops like radish or kohlrabi or swede underneath taller brassicas such as kales or purple sprouting broccoli or things like that. So it's essentially just expanding. It's on a longer time scale with a tree, but it's still that finding the niches for different crops at different vertical levels, literally physically where that space exists.
And I guess even, you talked about the evolution of plants, and most of our domesticated animals and plants originated in a treed environment. Very few things occur out in the open with nothing. I mean, there are grasslands, obviously, but so although we've bred things to be, more productive or more tasty or whatever other reasons we choose to breed varieties, a lot of them have originated from these, woodland edge or slightly shaded situations. So it's, this is nothing new in a lot of ways, and there's lots of parts of the world where it's the norm. But for some parts of the world, and certainly the UK and I think parts of the US, it is something that we're rediscovering now and understanding sort of why they work.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, I suppose the classic example of that, Ben, is any kind of climber. All climbers, whether it be beans or grapes or anything like that, they've all co-evolved to climb up taller plants around them, often trees.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Because how else would they have adapted those, I guess, abilities?
Exactly.
Right? They didn't just do that for fun. They had a purpose. So that makes a lot of sense. And this idea of the vertical stacking makes sense that you would apply it to trees as well, because their production hangs up in the air above the ground. Everything underneath it is basically open. But that's where it gets into the considerations, right? You guys mentioned, I believe it's light, water, and soil are the three critical components to think about, and how the tree interacts with all of those three is also another important factor.
Definitely, Jack, and in fact, it's those three things where you can potentially access loads of benefits of interacting trees and veg, but also you've got to be very careful that if you don't sort of envisage how those are going to interact, you can have negative effects as well. So it's important to take careful consideration when mixing trees and veg around those three subjects.
Yeah, and
the other thing as well, just on those three things, they are the things that are free to us. The risk is we go out and we go, we've got to buy fertility and we've got to buy irrigation and all the rest of it. But actually, sunlight and rainfall and the soil under your feet, once you've got a garden or a site, those things are there. They're free. So how do you make the most of it? How do you capture as much of it as possible and make use of it? And that's part of the beauty for me of agroforestry is you're maximizing the use of those resources that the earth has given us.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to expand on light a little bit, and we could talk about all the different aspects of it, because when you're planting a tree, it's a lot more intentional. You have to be a lot more intentional when you think about light because it's not a temporary plant. The seasons change, the aspect of the light, the way that the sun is hitting us changes. So there's really more to consider when you're making these decisions.
Yes, and I suppose an important thing, Jacques, is depending, like we were talking about just now, depending on where you are climatically, your concerns may be not enough light, or it may be too much light, and that comes into the design process. And it's important that I suspect where you are in San Diego, in the height of a very hot summer, sometimes protecting your vegetable crops from too much sunlight.
Oh yeah.
Could be an important consideration.
Yeah, one of the things that I don't think is as discrete of an example in the book, you guys talk about it, but deciduous trees, the way that I could use a deciduous tree in San Diego is very different, because I could grow, essentially, I can grow year round. So if I'm planting a deciduous, for example, I have a plum tree I planted in a garden bed, I'm thinking about the fact that it leaves out in the summertime, and the winter it drops its leaves, and now I get all that light back when the light is most diminished. So I've been trying to experiment with deciduous trees specifically mixed into my garden so I could get that protection of the leaves in the summertime to help protect certain crops, like maybe my lettuce, or even, like, for example, peppers, as you guys even mentioned, can do much better with a little bit of shade. So I'm trying to play with that tree and get the most of the light. And I think one of the hardest things for me is to figure out how I'm going to tackle the pruning of it. But it is really fun to play with the aspect of the light, the fact that it's deciduous, and the placement in the garden. There's a lot of different things that you could do to get the trees in the garden and still get vegetable production at the same time.
Yeah, and there's very few vegetables that actually require full sunlight all day.
Right.
And a lot of them will prefer to be in semi-shade. Things like lettuces and other leafy crops, will actually manage with very little full sunlight, particularly in hot summer. So the sort of the notion that everything's got to be in the sun all the time, we definitely realised is not true.
Yeah, and then speaking of the next one, this one's an interesting one that, being in San Diego, I had a hard time trying to rationalize to myself, like, the use of water and trees. I was telling you guys before we jumped on this call that right now in San Diego, we have our driest year on record, and we've had 0.14 inches of rain since July, and today it's like middle of January. So we haven't had anything. The ground is essentially dry. But one of the things that you mentioned, that fruit trees, or just trees in general, I should mention again that this book isn't just about fruit trees. There's a lot of variety of trees that you could grow and use in production, which we get into a little bit. But the tree's roots will break up, fracture the ground. They will have roots that decay, leave voids. Just the simple act of existing in the ground creates a network of cracks that allow water to infiltrate deeper into the soil. And so for me, like, especially since I haven't had my first major rain, I'm expecting any area that has my trees is going to be much better for drainage. I'm not going to have as much flooding because they've already got the soil ready to accept that water. But there are a lot of different ways that you could use trees when it comes to water that you guys mentioned in this book as well.
Yeah, so we certainly don't. Oh, go on, Andy, you go for it.
No, the one thing to add to that is it's one of those magical things in horticulture that if you manage it right, trees in the right place can aid drainage, but they can also boost the water holding capacity of the soil. The increased organic matter from leaf drop on a deciduous tree is going to boost your organic matter levels. So anywhere in horticulture where you can find a way of doing those two really important things, which is good drainage, but also good water holding capacity, is a win-win.
And you've got, as well as the actual effect that the trees are having on the soil, you've got the opportunity to use products from the soil to boost that as well. So one of the things we talk about quite a lot is using coppiced systems of things like hazel or poplar or alder, where they're grown specifically to create wood chip, which you can then use either to mulch your beds or potentially just to add to the soil to build your soil organic matter
Right.
and biology. So you're sort of and in doing that, you're also keeping the size of the trees in check. So you mentioned about your pruning challenges. Well, actually, for a lot of deciduous trees, you can just coppice, which is where you cut them right down to the ground every 2, 3, 4 years. So you're keeping them at a certain height, which then means they don't compete as much, so they'll provide some shade and shelter without getting too big, and you're getting these really useful byproducts out of it.
Yeah, that was actually a really interesting aspect of the book. That when I first started reading it, I was just assuming it would talk specifically about like fruit trees and maybe some nut trees blended in, but you guys really break down a lot of different varieties or a lot of different ways to think of trees, I guess is another way to put it. Some might produce fruit, some might produce nuts, some produce wood for mulching, like coppicing, as you mentioned, or willows that you could make other products with, hazels, and even lumber discussion. I thought that was really interesting. The idea of planting some trees with the ultimate goal of having lumber, to me, sounds, I don't know why that would appeal to me so much. It almost seems like you're investing in your future by planting a tree that you know that you will get something out of in some long run investment. But
or your grandchildren,
exactly,
maybe.
yeah. And I was like, wow, what a neat idea to just be like, hey kids, like in 40 years, like see those trees out there, that's going to be your retirement or something.
And that approach is quite common in France, where there's quite a few silver arable systems where the farmer will plant something like walnut or oak when he's young, and effectively that becomes his pension when he's older. So the field gradually moves from a wheat field over to an oak plantation. And then he cuts that down for his retirement, and then starts the cycle again. So it's not. It's almost a transitional phase of rotation. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, the thing is with these trees that you guys mentioned as well, is that incorporating trees into whatever system you have, whether it's a garden or a farm, there's a lot of benefits, and there's a lot of benefits to uncertainty, and especially lately. Climate is so uncertain, whether it's going to be hot, dry, flooding, no rain, everything in between. Trees have a lot of ability to handle that. And one of the things you guys talk about is flooding. And flooding is actually a major problem in a lot of different parts, especially flash flooding with major rain downpours happening in just a single day. It seems like trees are a great solution, especially for people who have farms that often get flooded.
Yes, I mean, I think, Jacques, you were talking about how little rain you've had there this year in San Diego. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, when the soil gets baked really, really hard, when you finally do get rain, quite often in that situation, it'll hit the surface and just, run straight off the land and not soak in. So having, like you've already mentioned, having that sort of fractured soil under the ground, in the rare moments when you do suddenly get a torrential downpour of rain, it enables your soil to make better use of it and absorb that rain, which if it's few and far between but intense, all the more important to get it to soak into the ground and not run off the top.
Absolutely. Yeah, you want to capture as much as you possibly can. And if your ground is dry and baked like that, you're just going to get sheet erosion and everything's going to just wash away. And it's really fascinating to see when we do get downpours. I'll walk in my garden and there's no puddles. It's like basically dry. The wood chip mulch and all the garden beds have soaked everything up. And then I go into my little dirt pathway next to my house and it's just hard packed, flooded. If you probably dig, scratch the surface, it'd be dry underneath, even in like pouring rain. So flooding is definitely something, not only just in the ability to hold that water, but slowing the water down by having leaves and being able to plant in rows that could direct water almost as like a swale system. There's just a lot of benefit there. And one of the other benefits that is a major challenge is wind. So if you guys wanted to expand a little bit on wind, that's something you probably have to deal with a lot more, especially in those cooler months before summer really hits.
Yeah, certainly in the UK and the west of the UK where we are, there's not a lot between us and the Atlantic Ocean, and so we get a lot of wind. And there's two aspects in a way to it. One is the physical impact of the wind and the damage that can bring to crops. And the other is the creation of these microclimates. So typically when you're sheltered from the wind by trees, you're 4 or 5 degrees warmer than you would be in sort of the full force of it. So that enables you potentially to extend your season. So for us, we're always trying to make our summers as long as possible. We tend to have coldish springs, cool autumn. So we want to try and push the warm summer as long as we can. And if we can get another 2 or 3 weeks at each end of the season, then that makes a huge difference for us and our ability to grow some crops or to increase the yields of the crops we've got.
It also, the wind has also interacts with the previous subject of water as well. And I'm not sure if it's the same for you there, Jacques, in San Diego, but quite often here, if we get a really hot, dry spell, it's not just the sun itself that uses up all the water in the soil and evaporates it, but also strong winds will accelerate that. They'll accelerate the evaporation of water from the soil, but they'll also accelerate transpiration rates from the plants themselves. So dropping those wind speeds, not just in winter and sort of strong stormy conditions, but also dry conditions, slowing that wind speed can help you to conserve that moisture as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very underappreciated factor in gardening as well. It's something I've talked about when I grow seedlings, is that especially in these early months, I mean, being in San Diego, it's odd because I could start my seeds outside, but the biggest factor that really affects them is that wind, because it'll strip the moisture right off the top of those, especially if you're doing seed starting in like cells. The surface is going to dry out so fast if it's a windy day compared to like the same temperature on another day where there's very little wind. And one of the things that was interesting that you guys mentioned too is just the stress that the wind can cause on plants. It'll literally cause them to not open their stomata as much. The leaves are smaller, and there's a lot of different effects that you see from that. So how do you guys go about properly building a windbreak? Because I know I've seen this example before when talking about fences, but when you make a windbreak too solid, you do actually end up with other issues as well, right?
Yeah, so it tends to hit that solid wall and then eddy over the top, and you end up actually with worse conditions on the other side of a solid wall potentially than if it was just the wind going through. So what you're aiming for is something that's permeable, something that slows the wind down but doesn't stop it. And typically those are deciduous plants. You might want to put a little bit of evergreen stuff in there, but you certainly don't want an evergreen block. And then also trying to get a bit of variation into the height, so that not everything is exactly the same height. And then the other risk in a way with trees, once they get going and get taller, is you sometimes end up with a nice bushy tree at the top and a bare stem at the bottom, and of course that can then sometimes funnel the wind underneath too much. So keeping some lower shrubby growth, whether that's through coppicing the trees or whether it's through incorporating some smaller shrubby type plants underneath, so you've got some protection lower down as well.
Yeah, and I should mention that the book actually goes into, you get a lot of detail on different species and different heights and different options to blend to create these sort of windbreaks. Because something like a windbreak is beneficial for even a garden if you don't have a crazy amount of space and you might have a windy exposed garden. Putting a windbreak in the right place could actually really make a huge difference on your garden potential as well.
And it doesn't even need to be that tall.
Right.
So typically you'll get protection from about 10 times the height of the tree or the bush.
Wow.
So even you know I've seen examples where you can grow, say, a trained fruit tree. It might only be 6 foot tall, or even 4 foot tall, and a 4 foot tall tree would give you potentially 40 feet of wind protection. So you can adapt these things in an infinite number of ways to suit the size of your system or the size of your garden.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the third sort of, I guess, free aspect that nature provides for us is soil. And I appreciate that you guys really care about the soil. I could tell that you care because you also mentioned the differences in hydroponics. And I agree that having soil to grow your food is very important. But the actual interesting thing about trees that people think about a lot, and you guys mentioned this as well, is how the root systems actually work in a tree. There's that classic example, I guess I didn't even know there was a word for it until you guys mentioned it, but some trees do have that classic example of heart-shaped root system underneath that's kind of similar to the canopy above. But most trees, as far as I understand, basically send out a small taproot into that soil, and most of the roots are coming off from from the surface level. Is that right?
Yes, I mean that was one of the big discoveries for me, Jack. Researching this book and writing the book was that learning curve.
Oh yeah.
I'd assumed many trees had a big deep taproot, and many trees had a heart-shaped root system. But I think we say in the book, 80% of trees actually have what's called a lateral root system. So the majority of their roots, are up to 80% of the roots, are in the top 60 centimeters of the soil. So it's very important to understand that. And again, we mentioned in the book that, that top 60 centimeters of soil is where almost all of your vegetable roots are as well. So managing that interaction between the tree roots and your vegetable roots is another careful area for consideration.
Well, Andy, you only got 2 foot of topsoil anyway, so below that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh wow! So you're on rocky terrain underneath with a 2-foot soil cap, basically.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's right. 2 foot of topsoil, and then sort of below that, 80% rock,
wow!
20% soil.
That's a different system for sure. I'm sure that has its own considerations. But in thinking of these trees, it is interesting because even if they don't have that deep taproot, they are still able to pull with smaller feeder roots and little connections with mycorrhizal fungal populations. They're probably able to cycle and pull up a lot more nutrients. But the thing that's really interesting to me to think about is that as that tree is growing, it produces its leaves. Those nutrients go into those leaves, which then return to the surface of the soil. So it seems like the tree is really helping cycle the nutrients. Even if it isn't going much deeper than 2 feet, it's able to at least move some of those nutrients from the lower levels back up to the surface of your soil, where maybe some of your annual vegetables can make better use of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you have got a deeper soil, which obviously a lot of farms do, then you can push the roots further down by root pruning and by cultivation. So there are opportunities to force them lower, and then that recycling will happen. But obviously, a lot of as well as your minerals that you're bringing up from the soil, there's obviously a lot of sugars and things that are being produced by the tree by photosynthesis. So they are creating fertility in that sense, which the leaves will then drop as well. So there's this dual action in a way, I guess, of creating the fertility from sunlight, but also mining mineral fertility from the soil.
Yeah. The other aspect that I don't know why I never thought about this, or maybe I never even knew about it. But you guys mentioned how the trees also help cycle the carbon in the soil as well. Whether that's stored as carbon for long term is a different question, but just the ability to push the carbon into the soil and cycle it with the plants. The thing that I found was interesting was that part of it goes as exudates, which are like roots giving off, essentially, if I understand correctly, essentially giving off like sugars to the soil, the fungal life, the bacterial life, the rhizosphere, all the life around the roots. And then that life is able to, of course, make the soil net healthier in general. So anytime your soil could get improved and have a larger population of life is always good. No matter how you're cycling in your vegetables, that seems like a really nice benefit. And the fact that the roots actually decay and regrow continuously, I don't know if that's something I ever really knew or never really thought about. So just that fact alone means that as they decay those roots and leave them in the soil, you are starting to build, even if it is slowly, some amount of organic matter. You're leaving void space for water infiltration. So I could definitely see those benefits for sure translating into whatever else you're growing.
Yeah, and alongside of that, Jack, you've got all of the fungal populations that are developing alongside that. So as soon as you stop cultivating a bit of ground, then fungi will come back, because fungi don't like being disturbed. They don't like being cultivated or sprayed with anything. So, but as soon as you leave that alone under a tree, then those populations will build. And then there's certainly studies showing that the carbon sequestered by fungi is probably equal to that of the tree itself. And then once you've got them in place, they're like your transport network, they're your roads, and that's where all the nutrients are getting transported along and back. So you can potentially bring nutrients from quite a long way away if you've got really good fungal networks underground.
Oh yeah.
One of the things we talk about, Jacques, in the book, if designed correctly, you manage your roots. So even if it's not the roots themselves, but the fungi that's attached to the roots with these symbiotic relationships can essentially act as a safety net underneath your vegetable crop. So especially very soluble nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, they get washed down past your, if you apply compost to the top of your vegetable beds, you do get heavy rain, and some of these nutrients rapidly get dissolved and washed past the roots of your plants. These can be picked up by the fungi or the tree roots, transported back into the tree itself, recycled up into the canopy, and then returned to the surface in form of leaf litter. So you're recycling any nutrients and water that do go past your vegetable crops.
Right. No, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And it actually speaks to something else you guys bring up in this book, which is treating this all as a holistic system. So there's a lot, like when we're thinking about the garden or a farm, there's so much going on around us that either we can't see or we don't notice. And a lot of that is under our feet, where we definitely can't see it, but we know that hopefully it's there. The other aspect are all the insects, the beneficial insects, the predator insects, and you guys also speak to that. So is that when you're planning a system, when you're doing a layout, are you thinking of trees specifically just for the insects in mind, or are you looking for multi-purpose trees?
I think that the interesting thing in there is it's almost all trees, Jack, have are multifaceted and multifunctional. So that there are definitely ways that you can. One of the important ways I always talk about is for me, there's three sort of crucial things about managing insects. Essentially, overarching, it's creating a habitat, and you're looking for food and you're looking for shelter. A food often with insects is pollen, so that's flowering from the trees. So that's flying insects. A lot of the flying predatory insects, but almost all, maybe not so much in San Diego, but definitely here in England, slug management is a big issue. And slugs are the best predator for slugs is beetles, and a vast number of beetles interact with deadwood, and parts of their life cycles revolve around. Parts of their life cycle require dead wood. So it's not just the tree itself, but what drops from the tree on the floor as well. That, on my farm, I would actively leave any branches or twigs that drop from the tree, leave them beneath the tree, because they're an important habitat as well as the living tree itself.
Right. That makes a lot of sense because they need somewhere to hide, or else why would they come there? The other thing you mentioned even is, like, for example, aphids. Like, you're never trying to eliminate aphids, because also I feel like that's a fool's errand unless you're going to war and you're literally just killing everything. I always, at the beginning of gardening, I started off with the mentality of fighting. I think a lot of people do. And very quickly, I think literally within 6 months, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And you just accept that you will have some amount of insects, but maybe you could control where they go. So for example, you guys mentioned like this one type of tree like might be attractive to aphids, which you might think on the surface is a bad thing, but the aphids are already there. So it's like, do you want them to go to your cabbages, or do you want them to go to this tree? And that's always going to be the better option. And it's just really fun to think about these systems where it's not only better for the environment, but it's also easier for the farmer, right? Like in my mind, if I don't have to go out there and go to battle, like that's making my life easier in the long run.
Certainly, Jack. And those trees that attract aphids, that they become a canteen for predatory insects.
Yeah, I bet.
So they will, you're actually actively increasing by allowing aphids to be in your garden. But like you said, you want them in the right place and in the right amounts, and having them in the right amounts. The natural organic way of achieving that is to proactively encourage predators, and trees are great at doing that, and both by providing pollen to the predatory insects, but even better, providing aphids for them to eat. Mm-hmm. that the major food source of these predatory insects is the pest species. So, we always talk about you're not trying to eliminate the pests, you're trying to keep them in a healthy balance with the predators.
Yeah, it's actually something we talk about a lot, because why would a lacewing or ladybug come to your yard if there's nothing for it to eat? So when people go out and buy these insects and release them outside, like there's a good chance they're just going to fly away. So that's always an interesting thing to think about. The other aspect of these systems are the fact that when you're thinking about a large farm, you're talking about alley cropping. So in the context of that, you're doing rows of trees, then rows of vegetables, and then you're intermixing other types of trees within it, right? So you're not just doing it's always rows of apples. It's generally a mixture of different rows in between the different alley crops. Is there a reason why you guys do that? Is it just to increase diversity, or is it thinking about the layout? There's a lot that goes into it.
I mean, in a way, it depends. So some farmers actually will just have apple trees, because that's what they want. They've got a market for apples, and that's what maximizes their system. As a rule, diverse systems are more resilient and more productive, but they're also more difficult to manage often.
Right.
They're more complex. So they add complexity, but they add resilience. And so we have a lot of discussions at our farm around how we balance the desire for diversity against the need to manage an efficient commercial system. So as one example, we've got one field where we have around 30 different species of fruit and nut tree. Wow. And I would, Helen, my boss, and I would love to mix it all up in the field, and have one almond tree here and a pear tree next to it, and all of that. But then when it came to harvesting, and we'd bring the gang in and we say, right, we want you to harvest the pears this week, and there's one here and there's one over there and there's one at the far end of the field, and you would miss stuff. You would, it would make it really difficult for the harvesting team. So we made the decision to keep all of our pear trees in one row and all of our almond trees in another row. And so although it's not perfect, actually that's for us is a good compromise, and there's still a lot of diversity within that field. Where you want different crops, Andy can talk more about his system, which is a bit more sort of mixed up. But effectively it's about deciding what you want the trees to deliver for you, and then thinking about how you're going to manage them, and then trying to balance those two objectives.
There's also, Ben, of course, diversity within apple trees. So if you did just want to put in apple trees, you'd want to put in a mixture of different kinds of apple trees. They'd blossom at different times. They would crop at different times. Probably produce leaves and drop leaves at different times. So within just apples or just pears, there's diversity to be explored there as well.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I'm actually really grateful to have discovered this book early on, because the long-term goal of ours is to eventually go to somewhere where we could have a little bit more space and land. And I think the first thing I'm going to do is actually try to design a way where I could blend in the different things that work for me in my area, but also on those goals, because that's an important thing you guys bring up a lot in the book, which I thought was really nice to see, is that there isn't a blueprint, right? That here, take this, do it at your place. Everyone has different goals. They have different climates, different soil, different needs. And so there's always a system that you could make work where you are, but sometimes you have to put in a little bit of that work. And it was really fun to also read through the case studies of other farmers that you've spoken to that have basically figured this out through trial and error, right? Because a lot of times you really don't know what's going to work for you where you are. And it seems like both of you guys have also had changes in your system, right? As you build it out, you realize that maybe this works a little bit better here, or like you were mentioning, maybe we should only have pear trees. So it's always an evolving thing, and there's always a solution or option for probably anyone, depending on where you live. You just have to think about the different trees and the way that you're going to balance it.
Yeah, for me, Jacques, that's one of the most exciting creative things about the subject is the uniqueness of everybody's garden. Even every garden in San Diego is going to be totally different. Let alone if we're comparing San Diego to the west of England. But I think that is, other than the key principles of designing your own system, I'd love people just to grab onto that idea that, you know, it really is what you look at your own garden and both, you know, what can I achieve with trees? What can they give to me? But also, what problems do I need to solve in my garden that trees, you know, can help me solve? So whether that be water infiltration or windbreak or shade, you know, each situation is going to be completely unique. So I really like the idea that people would approach a design process as a really creative, personal situation that, you know, when you view it like that, can be really enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the other things, I mean, there's so many ways to use trees as we've learned and as this book holds, but one of the other ones I didn't even think about really, I know they exist, but I never really thought about incorporating are even trees that can fix nitrogen in the soil, which, as you guys mentioned in the book, is often one of the hardest nutrients to lock down and have where you need. So that might be even one that I experiment with, because I know that some warmer climate nitrogen fixing trees will do really well here. And that's part of that plan, right? Is every climate is different and everyone has different tools to play with. For me, this has been very fascinating, and it's reinforcing me wanting to blend more trees into my garden and think about that long-term future where hopefully I'll get to design a system like this. Because to me, this system just looks like it's more interesting to work with long-term. If I were to have a farm, I wouldn't want it to just be the same rows of crops that I just cycle back and forth. Having the blend of trees that are constantly growing, they're constantly changing, the way you set up your system is adapting, and you get that marketable benefit of the fruit, the deliciousness of the fruit, the different trees. There's just so much in this world to unpack, and I'm glad that you guys put this all down into a book to make it easy for everyone. It's been a pleasure talking to you guys about Silvohorticulture, which is the title of your book. And I highly encourage anyone who's interested in growing trees, not just fruit trees, just trees in general, blending them into a garden space, or if you're somebody who has a small farm or wants to start a small farm, I would start with a book like this for sure to get your head around it, because there's just so much value to unlock with trees in the garden for sure. And thank you, Andy and Ben, for coming on and sharing all this information. And like I said, I can't speak highly enough about this book. It was a great read. And thank you guys for writing it.
Thanks, Jacques. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Really enjoyed chatting to you, and really interesting comparing the challenges between San Diego and the west of England.
Yeah, it's pretty different, but there's definitely lessons that could be learned for both of us that we could share. See you guys next time. Maybe at some point I'll come visit the UK and I'll try to stop by your farm. I've never been up there, so that would be a really fun adventure.
Look forward to showing you around.
That'd be lovely. Great chatting to you, Jack.